Hi everyone, hope you're all well. This is Wednesday's CPD or whatever day of the week you might be watching it on, and the focus is reading. So obviously that ties into one of the key lesson ingredients or lesson principles, if you like, that we've been returning to throughout this year's training and all the work that we've been doing. A lot of what I'm going to refer to, a lot of the strategies, some of the quotations, pieces of research, I've kind of picked out of this book that I've just read in the last week, Alex Quigley's Closing the Reading Gap. You'll probably remember from previous CPDs, I've used his work quite a lot before because he also wrote Closing the Vocabulary Gap a few years ago. And a lot of the work we've done around sort of explicitly teaching vocab has kind of been drawn from his many ideas and resources. Really good book. I'd recommend it. I don't want people to think, oh, Helen's read another book, so that's the direction that the training's gone in. It very much is tied into what we've said is an integral part of our knowledge-rich curriculum and of our sort of lesson principles. So just a reminder there that we've got this idea that we want to be providing opportunities for reading whenever we possibly can, whenever it's appropriate. And let's be honest, as the main medium of getting information across, it's always going to be appropriate. But it's what we do with that reading and how we encourage it that might change. And allowing those opportunities for students to read aloud, for us to read together, and really promoting reading, suggesting things that they might read if they're interested. That whole kind of trying to create a culture. And we know that sits alongside the quality explanation, where the teacher obviously has a massive role to play. We're not just putting text in front of children and seeing what happens. We're explicitly teaching the vocab. We are maybe providing graphical maps, concept maps, fishbone diagrams to help them to build up that mental model. And we're using it as a method of instruction. And a little bit more on that later on in the session. But you can see how it's a key part of our lesson principles. And it's also, I'm going to skip this bit and come back to the retrieval. It's also a key part of our school development plan. So one of the main strands is that we said this year we're really going to focus on improving literacy. And if we break that down, obviously the bit we're really focusing on in today's training is this promoting reading for pleasure, as it says there, but we're going to think about it in a bit of a bigger context in the curriculum as well. The active ingredients that we identified on that school development plan, the things that need to happen in order to meet that goal of improving literacy. For reading specifically, we said that all teachers will regularly read subject-specific text to students, read aloud, and the students following the ruler, and that we'd make that reading book an essential part of school equipment. Tutors would have a role in checking that the students have it, and every morning in step time there'd be 10 minutes reading. Now those two things happen. There's no doubt about that. When we were able to get into lessons on learning walks and get round in step time, it's evident that those two things happen and they happen well. So where we're at now is not about saying, all right, so we've done that, been there and done that. It's about saying, right, how can we fine tune it? How can we build upon it? Those active ingredients are there, but until we can really say we've got this reading rich curriculum and we've got a culture of reading, there's still quite a long way to go. And so this CPD is part of what will be a programme, I'm sure, of different CPD where we really think about that. And lots of work will be done on it over coming months and years, because it's not something that can easily be achieved overnight. So I'm going to go back to the retrieval. And as always, I'm going to try and model something that you could do in the classroom. So we've mentioned before this idea of goal-free retrieval tasks, and that is you would present your students, or in this case I'm presenting you, with an image, and it would need to be an image or a photo or a diagram that the students had seen before and were familiar with. But you take away any labels, any annotations, explanations, and you just give it over to the students and you ask them to retrieve absolutely everything they can that links to that image and that's relevant to the image. So it's better than just giving them boxes to fill in or labels to fill in, because you're asking them to really form connections and make links and think about, oh, but that could be relevant, and actually I'm going to make the link between that piece of knowledge, even though we weren't talking about that when we used that diagram or when we looked at that diagram. So goal free, there's no limitations, and then as the students are completing it, you would just go around the room, scan around the room, and while you're checking flashcards, glance over the shoulder and see the kinds of things that they're putting on, because that would be really telling. It would be a really useful sort of formative assessment method for you to see what links are they making and how much are they able to actually retrieve just based on one stimulus, one prompt. Okay, so you could do that. So you've seen this diagram before. Retrieve absolutely everything you can that might link to that diagram. Think beyond the obvious. All right, off you go. So I'm not going to sit here for 5 minutes. Pause the video if you want to have a go. But there's the diagram in its complete form, and it was labels, but hopefully you would have put more than that. You might have made the link to, of course, I hope you realise that we're looking here at schema. So you might have thought about this idea of forming connections and developing schema and secure schema in the minds of our students. Hopefully you understood this idea that what we need to do as teachers, we're the experts. You might have had words like expert and novice on there. When we are talking to students, our words are transient. Our schemas, the connections that we make, the understandings that we have, they're totally invisible to our students unless we make them visible, unless we model, unless we talk out, think aloud, unless we make those things visible to our students and make them permanent somehow and concrete by making them visible, by putting them in some sort of visual graphics. That's where graphic organizers and the principles of dual coding really come into play. So you've seen that diagram before. You might have also linked to that the principle of forgetting. When words are transient, we have the forgetting. You might have talked about the forgetting curve. You might have talked about the need to encode, making it concrete and permanent, a graphic, principle of dual coding. There's so many different things that you could have linked to that, and that would be really telling to see what your students manage to retrieve when given such an open-ended task, if you like. Okay? So you might think, well, what's that got to do with reading? Ideally, what we do when we are designing our retrieval tasks is we retrieve knowledge that's going to then be relevant for what we are moving on to. It's not always possible, and it depends the point in the course you're at. But actually, this is relevant. I've asked you to retrieve this knowledge about the importance of making the implicit explicit and using something concrete and visual, because this is really relevant to reading. Okay, and hopefully you'll see how as I progress through this video, this training. So I'll just leave you to read this quote. This is something taken from the book, from Alex Quigley's book. Okay, and I think, hold my hands up, and I'm sure many people would be in the same boat and would agree, very little training, if any, on how to teach academic reading, and probably had my eyes closed for a long time about how many students in the class might be drowning when I'm presenting them with a piece of text to read at their desk. I'm concentrating on the explanation and the knowledge and my discipline. And am I really looking carefully for those clues that tell me, but that child's not understanding a word of what they're reading because their comprehension isn't strong enough. And that child actually is staring at that piece of paper, but they're not able to read it fluently. So their cognitive overload, they're trying to piece together the phonics, their understanding of how the letters translate to sounds, and they're losing track. And actually, there will have been students, I am sure, in my class experiencing that I won't have realised. And I honestly think that we have to kind of open our eyes up to that, because this statistic here shows us the scale of the problem. 1 in 4 children, by the time they start with us basically aren't at the expected reading standard. So what we consider to be natural, and we take it for granted, that fluency, there will be children in our class who do not have that. And it's not just the children who are on the SEN register, or who have been labelled somehow as dyslexic or whatever else. There will be children that actually, unless we're very careful, go under the radar, but are not engaging with our curriculum and are not accessing some of the knowledge that we think they are because of their reading, or the lack of ability to read as fluently and as naturally as we might need them to. And we'll have to remember as well, we're presenting them with texts that they're not as familiar with. Primary school do an amazing job of getting children to learn to read, to learn the basics, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But most of their work is based around fiction. And then here they are starting secondary school with us, and in every lesson they will be experiencing a different type of informational text. It's a different type of reading. So Alex Quigley, throughout the book, talks about lots of different things, and essentially it follows this sort of structure really, in terms of how we bridge that gap, how we close that reading gap that is so massive. And we see it mostly in children who are from disadvantaged backgrounds, and we know there's all sorts of factors and all sorts of reasons why that might be, but we've got to do something for these children. Because if they aren't able to access our curriculum, of course they're not going to achieve well. And if they are going from one lesson to another, feeling themselves as though they're having failure after failure, because they were asked to read a worksheet there and they couldn't. They were asked to read aloud in that lesson and they were stumbling. They were asked to answer some comprehensive questions in that lesson and they couldn't find what they needed in the text. Then imagine what that's going to do for their motivation. So this is a really important issue. And the first thing that Alex Quigley suggests is that teachers need to be trained in how to basically teach pupils to read, or how pupils learn to read, I suppose, more to the point. And he refers to the science of reading. Now, that is certainly not what I claim this CPD to be, definitely not. And I think we're probably quite a long way from being able to do that. But I do think there's certain things that we can acknowledge, and little things we can understand a little bit more about the science of reading and how young children learn to read, so that when we have struggling readers in our class, we can just maybe intervene, spot it, seek advice, know how to help them, some strategies. So, and actually it would benefit all of our readers, not just our weaker readers. So the science of reading is one strand. And forgive me because I'm going to refer to two examples from my experience currently of homeschooling my daughter, Rosie. And it's been eye-opening. And it's really shown me that we totally take for granted the natural and fluency of how easy it is when we pick up a book to read. And, of course, I've known that I learnt to read at some point, but I can't remember how. And when you are on the sort of other side and trying to teach somebody or help them, and trying to do what they would be doing if they were in primary school, it makes you realise just how complex it is. So most primary schools, or in fact all primary schools, I'm sure, use phonics, and evidence suggests that that is the best method of teaching a child to read. It was quite contested at one point, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest phonics is the best way to teach a child to read, because of how the brain works and because of the science of reading. And so we teach children to take the grapheme, the letter on the page, and understand what sound that makes, the phoneme. And then we teach them that certain letters come together and form digraphs or trigraphs, and that makes a different phoneme, a different sound. And we teach them to blend those sounds together to be able to read words. And it's a fantastic process to watch. So if we had, I'll do a little modelled example in primary school mode. If we had the letter O, we teach children that's O. So we look at words and we say cot, otter, cot, easy. Dog, sock, etc. W, quite easy, always seems to make the same sound when it's on its own anyway. And then we teach them when they've got to grips with a lot of those singular sounds. We then start teaching children what happens when two letters come together in a digraph. So here we have ow. So we teach children it's not o, w anymore, it's ow. And so we have owl and cow, prowl, flowers, and on their, in their classrooms and in front of them, sometimes when they're doing their learning, they'll have that reminder of the relevant one. And so we see a picture of a cow, so that reminds us it's the ow sound. And this is great. And actually, an awareness of this phonetics is quite important because some of our readers will be struggling with even this bit when they're faced with a word like, let's say, height. Actually, they might not have recognized, it's quite a tricky word to look at. They might not have recognized that I sound in the middle. So they're looking at height and they're struggling. And if a sentence depends upon you being able to read height to make sense of the whole sentence. So I think it's useful to have that awareness of the phonics. But then look at this. So we've been working on the ow sound. We know when we see an O on its own, it makes the O sound. Read that. Well, that's not what I've taught, is it? Go. Well, that's not O. Open. That's not O. Open. Well, it's not. And then we've got owl, which we were really confident that owl made OW, made the owl sound, owl. But then I've got the word slowly. Look, I've even got owl in the middle there. But I don't say it slowly. So it's really, really complex. And, the English language, I guess, is. And I'm sure primary teachers have lots of strategies for dealing with all of this. And I know that they teach children to have to recognize certain words, they call them tricky words, just on sight. Like go is one of your tricky words. You just have to see it and learn that's go, not go, and that's fine. And your fluency increases. But imagine for one of our students, and remember, this is not a ridiculous suggestion, that we would have students who are still struggling phonetically to make sense of some of these letters on the page. Imagine how hard that is and how much of their cognitive, processing is being taken up with just this. They're not grasping any of the other kind of comprehension that we need them to have from a sentence or a text that they might be reading, let alone being able to pick up on metaphors and similes and all of these other wonderful literary things that we take for granted. So that was an anecdote really from my own experience of trying to teach my daughter. But it really makes you think, doesn't it, about what our students may be struggling with. Of course, many of them won't be, but some of the strategies that I'm going to kind of suggest and talk about here will benefit all students because it's very much about understanding and getting the most from reading. So another anecdote, my daughter goes through phases. We always have stories at bedtime, and she goes through phases, and we've been through the Roald Dahl and wanting Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the Big Friendly Giant and George's Marvelous Medicine. And then we go through phases where we almost want to revert to our early childhood. And she wants Mr. Men stories that she used to have when she was 2 and 3, and she's 5 now. And recently she's gone through a Mr. Men phase. And I was reading to her just the other night, Mr. Uppity. And in Mr. Uppity, the words that you would come across include indignant, curiosity, words like spluttered, so nice descriptive words, sentry, announced furiously, and original. Now, okay, they're not impossibly hard words. They take a bit of exploring and a bit of unpacking with a young child because they're not words they would hear very often. But why this kind of really sort of struck a chord with me is because I've just recently been reading this piece of research by Logan, piece of research done in America, in Ohio. And what they found is that using 60 commonly read children's books, they calculated that in the first 5 years of a child's life, A child who's read to daily, approximately 5 children's books a week, and it might be things as simple as the Mr. Men stories, will have heard 1.4 million more words than children who were never read to. And you might think, well, obviously that's not 1.4 million different words, but that amount of language that they're being exposed to that a child that's not read to isn't exposed to. And you might think, oh yeah, but there's lots of talk in households. It doesn't have to be reading. Children are exposed to language all the time. But are they really exposed to that kind of language? Do we really, in normal conversational talk around a 4 or 5-year-old, use words like indignant? Some people may, but I suspect many don't. And so it's about that exposure. And that's the gap. And that's why I said we're talking in particular the group of students who are most affected by this reading gap that is posing massive problems for students and their access to the curriculum. It's the disadvantaged students that are hit hardest. Now, I'm not saying that if a child's disadvantaged, it means their parents didn't read to them, because that would be totally unfair. But we do see there's a correlation here, and that's worrying. So Alex Quigley says that what we need to do, alongside understanding a bit more about the science of reading and what our students might be grappling with and having that understanding of phonetics, we need to ensure we have a coherent reading-rich curriculum. Well, a reading-rich curriculum is a knowledge-rich curriculum, which is absolutely what we're setting out to achieve. But this is where we really need that disciplinary lens again. We talked about this a long time ago about having that lens. So when we're teaching our children to write as scientists, we're breaking it down with them and we're talking to them about, well, how does a scientist present information? What does writing like a scientist look like? And how is that different from, say, writing as a historian? Well, we need to do exactly that same process, but with reading. So when we are presenting our students with a text, we need to help make it explicit. Remember, we're trying to make all what goes on in there quite naturally and implicitly to you explicit to the students. We need to talk to them about the lens of reading as a historian, reading as a geographer, reading as a linguist. What strategies and what lens do you need to apply? And that's quite important that we're doing that and we're actually using that language with the students. So if it's in history, we're saying to them, yes, well, we want to use this source, but when we read a source, we have to look critically at where the source has come from, and we need to corroborate that source with other sources, and we need to look for the clues about the historical context. What period are we talking here? We look for the dates, whatever. Yeah, history teachers, I'm sure, would be able to tell me a great deal more. But they will do it very naturally. We have to teach it to our students so that they can start to do it more naturally, because it will take time. So alongside that and helping them to develop that lens, there's also a whole world of things we can do around providing them with texts, obviously in the classroom, but then what can we be doing to encourage them, to promote them to read around our subject outside of the lesson as well, and to help them to develop those skills. So I'm going to show you this. Curriculum leaders have already seen this. This is a pilot for next year. So I'm just really giving you a bit of a heads up of something that we plan to do. And so it ties into the homework strategy. So we're keeping the homework exactly the same, the principles of, flashcards, retrieval practice and reading. But a slight tweak that we're going to try with year 7 for the reading is actually to give them a reading booklet. And hopefully they'll still have time to read for pleasure, and they might choose to read fiction as well. But this would be non-fiction articles or readings that are selected by the department, just one for this half term to try it. And the students would be given that booklet, and they'd be given a little bit of a schedule so it's not overwhelming, so they learn to space it out. And the idea would be that they would use this structure here. And this is basically training them so that they can then be applying this in lessons and in their own study time. We're training them on how to read well. So the idea being that they read And as they're reading, they identify new vocabulary, and they then use that method of sort of condensing, or just a word or a very short sentence, to condense what they've read, to check their understanding. So they've read it and they think, I can't condense it. Well, that means they haven't understood it. Let's go back. What words meant? I haven't understood it. Do I need to ask for help? Do I need to look something up? And that's what we're going to be basically suggesting to our students that they should be doing. And so we insist they do it with these selected articles, but then we open up their world by suggesting and almost providing just a list of books or articles, web links that they might be able to engage with. So we're providing them with this wealth of knowledge, but we're helping them with the strategies to be able to do it and to be able to access it. And we can model that in the classroom. So, well, this is where I have a panic because I can't get back into my PowerPoint. There we go. So I think that's quite important as well. And actually just thinking about this idea of, reading lists and sharing things that we'd like our students to read, just look at what we've been able to achieve, or you guys have, with this distance learning. The work that's being set, the things we've recommended, the challenges, the try reading this, try doing that, fantastic. Now, yes, we've got about 70 students that need a physical printout in order to be able to access work. But that's 70 students across the entire school, as far as we know. So when we're thinking about broadening students, reading, exposing them to wider texts, there's an amazing amount of opportunity by looking at what's out there and what web links we can provide, what online libraries and so on. There's fantastic resources, and we just need to kind of signpost them to our students. Okay, so the third thing that Quigley talks about that we need to do if we're going to bridge or close this reading gap is really simple. We need to be aware of how difficult a text is, make sure it's accessible to our students, and give them lots of opportunity for practice. So Quigley talks about the arduous 8, and these are the 8 things that you have to consider when looking at a text. And I put a big old circle around number 1 because it just highlights to us how important that background knowledge, and number 2 as well, that vocab, is to actually be able to access it. And that's the bit we can do something about. So no, it's not easy to turn back time and teach a child phonics and get them reading fluently. But yes, we can do something about ensuring that the knowledge is really secure and we're explicitly teaching vocab, and that will massively help them to access any text that we put in front of them. But important to also be aware of, is it using metaphorical language? Are they able to make inferences? When you read, you have to build up mental models. Is the child able to do that? Are they able to look for clues? If it's a textbook, for example, like number 7 here, are they able to understand that we can use the glossary, we can get a hint from the title, the structures that are there? So there's lots of things to think about that make a text accessible or not accessible. And he refers to them as the arduous 8. And the more practice a student has and the more exposure they have to different texts, the better they get at dealing with those things and learning how to approach it. So we have to give them lots of practice. And so this idea of allowing opportunities for reading, there's loads of different reading strategies in the classroom. We can present students with a text and expect them to independently, silently read. We can do teacher-led reading, which might be more appropriate if we know really what the goal of that is comprehension. We want them to understand something. It's full of complex vocabulary. It's probably best we read it to them, they follow along. We use our teacher instruction, we keep pausing, we check their understanding, we explicitly teach the vocab. There's other things you can do as well, paired reading, choral reading, probably best in the language classroom, I would think. Certainly it's used more in primary, where they'll have one text, one paragraph, for example, and that one paragraph will keep being revisited over and over to get that fluency, to mean you're recognising words on sight, and pronunciation and so on. So there are different strategies, and I think the thing is, as teachers, you have to decide what is the goal of this part of the lesson, this reading part of the lesson, and therefore what is the best strategy to use. So this is the bit I think that we have the most control over and that has the most strategies that we can do in the classroom. And it's about ensuring that our pupils can understand the text in front of them. So it's much more about aiding comprehension, and it's about them becoming strategic and knowledgeable readers. Because without realizing it, when we read, especially when we read academic text, we are really strategic. And we bring a lot of knowledge to it as well. And we have to try and train our students to do that too. And this really will benefit all students. And this was a quote that Quigley used in his book, and I think it's quite powerful, really. It's almost like this is really important. If you're worth your salt, then you're going to do this. It's going to be your absolute goal that every pupil becomes a knowledgeable and strategic reader. And how do we do that? Well, there's a few questions. I've put the questions in the yellow boxes there. Hopefully they stand out. Apologies, this is literally a photograph from a page in the book rather than type it all out. So first thing we should sort of ask ourselves, okay, so when we're giving students a text, how deliberately are we modelling to them? Are we explicitly showing them how we chunk down the act of reading? Are we helping them understand that sort of before, during and after stage? Because we need to. So before reading, are we showing them that as an expert reader, before I start reading, I'm looking at the title, I'm looking for clues, I'm thinking about the context of this part in relation to everything else I've read, or even the title of the book. And I'm activating my prior knowledge and I'm making predictions. And this is all going on in my head before I start reading, but it's helping me then when I do start reading to make those inferences and to build up that mental model. Then during reading, I'm actually asking questions of myself to monitor my understanding. So I've read a sentence and I'm thinking, have I understood that? Yes, I have. I can read on. No, I haven't actually. Let's reread. Let's go back. And I'm creating that mental model. And then I might have to adapt and amend some of my predictions that I made before I started reading, because now I've read, that might have changed. And then even after, I don't stop there, even after I've read, I seek coherence. I think, oh, how does that fit in with what else I've read? And I summarize that text and I revisit again my predictions. And I might further generate more predictions about what's coming next. And I evaluate. And this process I'm doing, and I've got to show my students that that's what they should be doing. And there's things that we can do to help them. So this idea about before reading, I could give students a text with a title, and I could say to them, before you read anything more, this is the title, use that, activate all your prior knowledge on it. That could be my retrieval task. You know, say the title has got the word, I don't know, energy in it, and we've done energy, we've done a unit on energy. Right, we're retrieving everything we possibly can. We've activated our prior knowledge, we're predicting what we might be about to read. But we'll be wrong, some of those things will be wrong, but then that's the during stage where we reevaluate and we make new predictions. So good readers are meaning makers, not passive recipients. They're always going through that process of making those mental models and making those inferences. And it's exactly that metacognitive cycle that I've shown you before. And it brings in this other question. How consistently do you model and highlight comprehension monitoring? Do you pause when you're reading a text to your class? Do you pause and say, oh, let's just check we've understood that, and show them what you are internally doing and check their understanding? Because that's that process of metacognition that we've talked about before. It's self-regulating. You're self-regulating, you're self-monitoring. Have I understood? Or am I just staring at a piece of paper and, you know, my eyes are moving across some words, but I have no idea what we're reading about and what, you know, how I'm going to answer these questions. But there's things we can do to help. So I keep mentioning these mental models. Well, you as the expert have the mental model from that piece of reading. We want the students to build that and we want them to engage with the text, but we can help them out a little bit. We can present them with a graphic. Remember that concrete, permanent thing, reference point. It's going to reduce that cognitive load. It's going to help them make those inferences from the text. I can give them the graphic, a fishbone diagram, for example, or a concept map. There's all different ones. I've just given an example of some of the different ones you can use there. So graphic organisers can really come into play there as well. And, how often, another question to ask of your own sort of classroom practice, how often do you assume that a text that's been read has been understood? I suppose another way of phrasing that question would be, how often do we check? Probably often. I've seen it. I've seen some great sort of cold calling and checking of understanding. And there's different ways you can do it. So here's just a few examples that I've picked out. 3-2-1 strategy. I've never tried this. I like this idea. So from reading a text, you ask the students to identify 3 essential points, 2 new pieces of vocab, and 1 big idea. You can ask them to condense a text or to summarize a text in no more than 6 words. Of course, our usual sort of teacher why comes into play. So why do you think they used that word? Why was that placed first in the paragraph? All sorts of why questions and multiple choice. And I haven't really thought of doing this. I think of multiple choice being very much about knowledge retrieval, but actually we could use multiple choice after students have been given a piece of text to read to just check their understanding, couldn't we? And I quite like that idea because it's exactly the same principle of everything else we've said about the importance of checking understanding and checking that all students have understood all of what you wanted them to. That applies to a piece of reading because it's informational text, so we need to make sure they've understood it. Okay, so I love this quote. We need to be a reader who teaches as well as a teacher who reads. So when Alex Quigley talks here about nurturing pupils' motivation to read and for purpose and for pleasure, they have to see us as role models, people who read as well. And we need to talk about what we read. And we also need to allow students to see that they are all readers. Quite a lot of our students at the moment would say, oh, I'm not a reader. They are. They might just not be a reader of fiction books, and they might just not be somebody who feels the need to go to the library. But they're readers because they're readers of websites and they're readers of, recipe books, and they're readers. Now, we want to promote a reading culture and we want to encourage students to maybe read beyond their comfort zone and try a different book or try a different genre. But the first step is encouraging all of our students to see that they do have an identity as a reader and really promote that and nurture that. And then the last bit is really creating that culture, that reading culture across the school. And of course, this is not done overnight. And Amy's done loads of work in the English department, and actually everybody has really sort of helped to move towards this reading culture. But it's never going to be done. It's never going to be box ticked. So this is within the school and outside of the school that we really want to promote reading and a love of reading. And quite a shocking statistic, again picked up from Alex Quigley's book. 1 in 8 disadvantaged pupils own their own book. So 7 out of 8 children who fall in the disadvantaged category do not have their own book at home. Now that's shocking, and shows just how vast this gap is. And it's partly why we every year, and this is continuing again, Amy and Amy Smith and Amy Shield and Leanne this year, involvement in induction and transitions, ensure that we give each year 7 or new year 7 pupil when they're still in year 6 a book. And that's, immediately that's a massive improvement for some of those children. and we encourage them to read it over the summer and activities and all the rest of it. But it is something that we have to be really mindful of. So the more opportunities we can make to get them into the library, the school library, to tie it into our lessons, to use that resource, to encourage them, to lend them a book or to produce an article to give them, the better, because that's what we're fighting against for some students. And we know what impact that will have on their future, achievement and career prospects and all the rest of it, if they just never have the opportunity to overcome their reading barriers and to discover really what reading can offer them. So one final thing to share, and that is something that we're doing for our year sixes, and that is a reading challenge. Now, I stole this idea from my daughter's primary school. We've tweaked it slightly, and we're going to set this as a challenge to the new year six students. So every day through June, we're asking them to read with a little bit of a a gimmicky twist each day, and put the photos onto Twitter, and just to really try and get them engaging, because that's what primary schools do all the time, and we need to keep that momentum going as they come to us in September. There are websites online that are really helpful. So, for example, this one. Oh, no, I'll not try that. I've just done a screenshot here, but you can see it here. Reading lists, basically recommended reading lists, and you break it down for each year group. That's something that you might tap into. We can encourage our students or our parents to do the same. There's so much stuff out there, and I think it's just about us ensuring that we're opening our students' eyes, and encouraging them to use what's there. So I think that's it from me. I hope that's got you thinking a little bit about, how you currently use reading in your classrooms, and what barriers some of the students might face, and what strategies you might be able to use to sort of support their comprehension and to make the best of it. Okay, I don't know what my computer's doing now. Okay, so take care. There'll be another CPD session in a fortnight's time, and I will see you all soon.